Having settled the issue of the ESM, I think it's appropriate to finally address once and for all a small fundamental matter, which is the issue of debt. You see, in the end, it always comes back, constantly, time and time again, without fail. When Minister Giorgetti, during a hearing at the Chamber, was being asked questions about the ESM, he said something that could potentially spark a significant debate. In other words, he said, actually, our problem is the debt itself. Is that true? Yes. It's true. But there's a small piece missing just to complete the information. Formally, it's true. At the moment, our problem, or one of our main problems, is the debt. But the correct statement, if we really wanted to tell the whole story, should be our problem is the debt, given the current conditions we are in and the set of rules we are subject to, because under different conditions, the problem wouldn't be the debt. Debt is not a problem for Japan. Debt is not a problem for Great Britain. Debt is not a problem for anyone, in reality. It only becomes one within a certain set of rules or a set of circumstances that have been created. For example, why could debt be a problem for the United States? Well, because they have set a rule for themselves whereby beyond a certain absolute level of debt, a vote in Parliament is required to increase it. Sometimes Parliament is not controlled by the same majority as the President, so for political reasons, they use the debt ceiling as a bargaining chip to get something in return. Otherwise, they won't give the go-ahead to raise the debt limit. But it's a choice. It's not a debt problem because I have so much debt. Oh no. Japan, the famous Japan, has a public debt of 250%. Is its debt a problem? Its debt is not a problem. And why isn't Japan's debt at 250% a problem, while ours at 130% is? Or already 140? Bhutan, why might it not be a problem? The spread is low, our debt is at 140, while it was a problem at 110. Why can it be a problem? Was debt a problem for Spain when it was at 60? Why was Ireland's public debt a problem when it was at 30? Shall we finally tell once and for all the real story of public debt, how it works, and why it is a problem for us solely and exclusively because we do not have our own currency? Because otherwise, if we don't explain this story properly, unfortunately, we end up saying things that are formally true, but don't help us make the right decisions. Is our problem the debt? Yes. Why? Because we don't have our own currency. Let's take a normal country pick, whichever you like. Switzerland or Great Britain or Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungarino, Czech Reyes, the Czech Republic, Hungary. Let's take a normal country pick, whichever you like. Let's say Great Britain. Does the United Kingdom have public debt? Yes. Is public debt a problem for the United Kingdom? No. Why? Let's see how it works. Pay close attention. I'm taking a mini-bot. It represents public debt. In the English case, they are called gilt. Public debt is called gilts. Honestly, I don't remember the origin of the name, but that's what it is. So, British public debt is made up of many pieces of paper that are now digitized, or whatever you want to call it in reality. They don't physically exist in your hand, but if they were printed on paper like they used to be in the past, they'd look like this. So this is public debt. It says, well, here you see it backwards, but anyway, it says treasury bond. Okay? This is a banknote, same face value. Okay? 50 euros. For them, it would be 50 pounds. Okay? Are we clear? Anyway, this is debt, and this is a banknote, money. Who prints them? Who prints the debt? Who prints the banknote? Can we figure it out? Well, yes, the state prints them. Specifically, the treasury prints the debt, the central bank prints the banknotes. The central bank belongs to the state. So for the state, printing debt or printing banknotes is the same thing. Are we clear? It's not like it takes more ink to print this than to print that. Obviously, keep in mind that the vast majority of money, just like all government bonds, don't even need ink because they're credited to your account. When the central bank buys government bonds, it credits your bank account with a click, and that's money created. Are we clear? It's not like I'm making this up, it's been explained to you 1,000 times, even if with some difficulty by the central bank themselves. So I'm not teaching black magic, it's nothing like that. This is just how things normally work. The central bank creates money out of nothing. Are we clear? And the treasury creates the BTPs, that is government bonds also, likewise out of nothing. Okay? Good. Once we've reached this point, so for the state, issuing government bonds is exactly the same as printing money for a normal state. Then we get to the abnormal state, which is Italy or the other countries in the Eurozone. Once we've established that, for the state, printing money or printing debt is exactly the same. Let's see what happens. What happens is that the treasury issues public debt, so it prints government bond savers buy them, and in exchange they give the treasury money. If there are no savers, the central bank prints the money, just as happened with quantitative easing. With the billions from quantitative easing, the central bank prints the money and still gives it to the treasury. In the end, the process is always the same. The treasury issues a debt security and receives money in exchange, and then it spends that money. It's really easier this way. I mean, it's impossible for me. So, if there are savers who invest their savings in government bonds, that's a good thing. If there aren't any, the central bank steps in and it's the same. Why do savers do it? Well, savers do it because it's obvious. A government bond normally pays interest. It's designed to collect savings and pays interest that is adjusted to inflation. In the normal world, unless someone starts speculating with fixed rate bonds, long-term ones, things like that, which usually always end badly. But under normal conditions, the government bond serves to protect citizens' savings. Because if there were only banknotes, what would citizens do? They take the banknotes, there's nothing else then, put them under the mattress, in a safe, wherever the heck they want. But the savings that citizens need to have are eroded by inflation. So if there is inflation, meaning if prices go up, the securities, the money, in other words, the banknotes that remain in citizens' possession lose real value. With these, I used to buy 50 peaches. After inflation, with the same amount, I can only buy 40. So what happens then? What happens is that in order to collect citizens' savings and protect their purchasing power, and thus also encourage them to save, because it's right for citizens to have savings so that they can be prepared to face future problems. So it's normal for citizens to have savings, in fact. It's beneficial for citizens to have savings. If there's a need, if they have to change their car, if something breaks down, they need to have some money set aside so they can get through a difficult moment. So the citizen, the Republic encourages saving. The Republic protects savings in all its forms. This is even written in Constitution. So it's clearly important to note that in ours as well, it states that this is an absolute protection. The Republic protects savings in all its forms. So it's necessary for citizens to have savings. So what happens then? In order for people to have savings, if there were no government bonds and only cash existed, everyone would spend everything right away, because they think, if I just keep it like this, it loses value, so I might as well spend it all. At first, that might even work out, but in the end, it turns out badly. So what happens instead? It's necessary to encourage saving. So the state issues government bonds. The citizen gives their money in exchange. The state takes the money back, and the citizen ends up holding a government bond which at the end of the year is worth a bit less because of inflation. But in return, they receive interest equal to the rate of inflation. So the citizen doesn't lose out, and the state doesn't lose out either, because in the end, it's all the same thing. The state receives the money, but on the other hand, it pays interest to the citizen. Everything balances out. When the government bond matures, the state gives the money back to the citizen and takes back its government bond. At that point, the value of the government bond has decreased a little, right? So the state pays back a bit less because there has been inflation, but it has given the citizen the interest rate in return. So both sides break even. That's how it works. The purpose of the so-called government bond, and the reason why, instead of just printing money, states have chosen to use the government bond system is mainly, as far as I know, due to the incentive to save, because otherwise it wouldn't work. Are you following me? So the amount of debt is equal to the amount of citizen savings in a normal state. Whatever the amount is, to 100%, 300%, 500%, does it make any difference? It doesn't make any difference. Suppose there's an inflation rate of 1%, then this 500% debt to GDP ratio loses 1% of its value. And on the other hand, the state pays 1% in interest. Is it more? Is it less? No. Nobody loses, nobody gains, no matter what the amount of debt is. Okay? That's why Japan has a 250% debt ratio, but doesn't care about that 250% debt. It could be 300, it could be 400, it doesn't make any difference. But could the state ever go into crisis? Because when the government bond expires, the citizen, who therefore wants to have his money back when the government bond expires, might not have enough to pay it back. No, because he prints them. So when a government bond matures, the state issues new ones. If at that moment citizens do not want to give it more of their savings in order to repay the previous government bonds, the central bank steps in and prints the money needed to repay the citizens' credit towards the state. Can it run out of money? No, it prints them itself. There is absolutely no possibility of a natural default on debt in the same currency. Is that possible? Yes, there was the case of Russia, of Ecuador. Those are choices. That is, at a certain point, the state chooses, for its own reason, not to repay the debt, even if it's in its own currency, maybe because it wants less inflati, or because it simply doesn't like the people who currently hold government bonds. Can that happen? Yes. In theory, it can happen, but it's a choice. It's certainly not something forced. A state can never, if it wants to, fail to honor a debt denominated in its own currency because it prints the money to pay it back. Are we clear on that? Okay. Once this is clear, we understand that for a normal country, government bonds or debt are not a problem. In fact, they are a sign of private savings. It doesn't cause problems whether it's large or small, low or high. It doesn't cause problems. Okay? Now, unfortunately, we are dealing with the sad case of Eurozone countries or countries that borrow in a foreign currency for various reasons. Which is why, in short, I obviously wouldn't suggest to anyone to go and get into debt in dollars or something like that. What happens when Italy issues its BTPs? It collects citizens' savings just like before. But here's the catch. Hypothetically, citizens didn't want to or didn't have the money to subscribe to the new government bonds, then who would provide the funds? The central bank should provide them. Too bad the central bank might not be willing to provide them. Do you remember during the pandemic when Ms. Lagarde had just arrived and the spread was starting to rise? Of course it was. I mean, if that wasn't a crisis, what was? The whole country was shut down, shutters pulled down, lockdown will hug each other more warmly tomorrow, they said. Okay, if that's not a crisis, the spread was taking off and she showed up all cheerful in front of the cameras and said, the central bank is not here to close the spread. So magically, if the central bank doesn't want to subscribe to and guarantee a country's debt securities, that's when the state goes into crisis. But did they ever tell you this little detail when we joined the euro? No, because almost everyone always focuses on strong or weak currency issues. Yes, it's important. But when I began my criticism of the euro, I started from this simple concept. That the very moment the central bank stops guaranteeing the debt, and this happened with Greece, and that's when I opened my eyes, I took off the blinders I had on, and I realized that our debt, which is not small, was not guaranteed by anyone. That's not a minor issue, you know. So what happens then? What happens is that our debt, well, there are times when obviously it's not a problem. For example, right now there's high inflation, we have enormous savings, and Italian citizens aren't exactly happy, of course, to see the money they have set aside in their bank accounts being eaten away by inflation. So they're quite willing to buy government bonds there's a good interest rate, 4%, even 4.5%, right? And things like that. So you can imagine everyone lining up at the bank to buy BTP Valor and similar products. But it's clear that when the scenario was different, obviously, the kind of scenario that the current Minister of Economy would probably prefer, meaning much lower interest rates, well, if the rates are much lower, that is, if interest rates are at zero, citizens no longer buy government bonds because they say, why should I put my savings in something that yields zero? I'd rather just keep them under the mattress. So that's when the central bank has to step in and buy them. I leave aside which is the cause and which is the effect, that is, whether zero interest rates are caused by the central bank buying or not. But that's the situation. At the moment, we don't have any problems. That is, for all the BTPs we issue, there will definitely be enough savers to buy them. And so, much to the disappointment, let's say, of those who wanted to see us on our knees, because there are plenty of people who say, now we'll see them on their knees, we'll see them crying in front of us, right? Because the spread will start to rise, there's a government of sovereignness, and so on, things we've already seen before, right? Well, too bad it wasn't the right moment. The citizens, our savers, were buying up everything there was to buy. They buy everything there is to buy. So goodbye to those who hope to see us on our knees. But that's how the mechanism works, meaning that if by chance, when a government bond matures, the citizen doesn't want it because they think the interest isn't attractive, let's put it that way. They don't want to subscribe to it. Then where is the state supposed to find the money? Well, the central bank should step in, like in the rest of the world, in order to prevent the debt from being dangerous or considered dangerous. But let's suppose it doesn't intervene. Do you understand why debt is a problem? Yeah, debt is a damn problem. But it's only a problem if, at this moment, you're in the euro. Let's also look at the other aspect, because maybe that's what worries Minister Giorgetti the most. Namely, I have a large debt, right? This large debt, as we've said, under normal conditions matches inflation. But let's see what happens in a country where the rules of the European Union put the deficit under scrutiny. There are two parameters in the rules of the European Union, even in the newly signed ones: debt and deficit. Debt must not be higher than a certain level, but if it is higher than that level, even if it goes from 140 to 130 or to 120, nothing changes. You're still above that certain level, and so it's not acceptable. It doesn't matter if your debt trajectory is going down. In any case, you are still above a certain level, and therefore you have to do certain things. Because, well, you understand that high inflation erodes debt, right? That is, if the amount of debt is 110, 120%, 130% of GDP, in the case of high inflation, GDP rises even if production stays the same, because GDP is nominal, right? And on the other hand, the stock of debt is fixed, it doesn't get revalued, so it goes down. That's also what has happened recently, basically. There was high inflation, and as it happens, the debt went down. Small problem if there is high inflation, obviously, to pay the interest required by the debt beyond what has already been issued, and citizens demand a slightly higher interest rate. So the interest expense increases. Under normal conditions is not a problem, as we've said, because if I have 1,000 in debt and I have to pay 100 in interest, these 100 in interest are exactly equal to the decrease in the value of the debt due to inflation, so they balance each other out. But in the set of rules of the European Union, this 100 in interest paid on the debt count towards the deficit. So if I have to pay, if before I was paying 50 in interest on the debt and now I pay 100 because interest rates have gone up, then my deficit increases. Now, I can also say that my primary balance, that is, what I collect or earn, excluding the interest on the debt, which shouldn't be relevant, is positive. So, in other words, I am actually implementing restrictive policies because I am collecting more from my taxes than I am spending. Therefore, Italy's enormous public spending has always been lower compared to that of all other countries, because we had the primary surplus while the others did not. So our primary surplus, if it gets eaten up, if it simply isn't taken into account by the rules because they only look at the raw deficit, well then, in this case, the debt also becomes a damn problem. Why? Because if the debt is very high, you have to pay a lot of interest. The debt to GDP ratio doesn't change. So it should remind you that this wouldn't be a problem for a normal country. But for a country where the rules say the deficit has to stay like this, you pay interest on the debt, and if you want to keep the deficit fixed, you have to cut everything else. And so in the presence of high interest rates and also high inflationary condition that in theory would even be ideal for reducing the debt, assuming you actually want to reduce it, because we've seen that it's not really a problem, but in reality, it becomes a major public finance issue. Because if I have to pay interest on the debt and these interest payments go into the deficit and I can't go beyond a certain level of deficit, the result is that I have to cut other spending or raise taxes. So the Minister of the Economy already sees himself projected into the future where he has to cut things, pensions, for example, raise taxes, because otherwise he won't be able to stay within the required parameters. Now, in this scenario, we've deactivated something that was extremely dangerous. Because what was the purpose of the ESM? It was meant so that the moment someone due to this situation went underwater, here came Snow White's apple, and they would say to you, take the ESM. At that point, all your problems are solved. Too bad, your democracy is gone as well. So it's like saying, do you have problems? Let me invade you. You'll see everything will be just fine. With the tanks, coming in. After that, you don't have to worry about anything anymore, right? I'll take care of it. So, fortunately, we've gotten rid of the ESM, but the small problem of uncertainty remains. What's the main weapon? Well, the main weapon is that if we go down, the others go down too, basically. The additional weapon should be, you blackmail me and fine. But if I find myself with my back against the wall, you know what? I'll just say goodbye and print my own mini-bots instead of the money the central bank won't give me. There are plenty of weapons, but you understand that they're not exactly simple for a whole series of reasons. First and foremost, too many people still haven't understood this. Government allies, members of parliament, citizens, you still haven't understood this. I'm trying to explain it to you. I'd need a primetime slot on all networks, so maybe some people would finally get it, but I'll never have that. So let's start explaining it this way, and let's start spreading this around. Why does Borghi at a certain point say that money is a problem? Because of this. Because right now our public debt is becoming a problem, but it shouldn't be. And it's something that puts our spending on services, on healthcare, on everything at risk. Because as you know, obviously, the interest on the debt weighs on what we can or cannot spend, precisely at the very moment when the rules say that your deficit matters, not your primary balance, but your deficit. And on the other hand, we even at further risk. Because if for any reason, and we've already seen this happen with the very first spread crisis, right? Things could escalate. Citizens get scared and don't want to buy government bonds anymore. And at a certain point, well, the state eventually finds itself in serious, significant trouble, facing real difficulties. What's the other weapon? Well, the other weapon, of course, is that we are so big that, let's say, Greece held the whole world hostage for many years. Something like Italy, boom, could never collapse on its own. But you understand that this isn't really living. I mean, it's like the life of a suicide bomber with an explosive belt, in the sense of, look, if you bother me, then I'll blow myself up. So let's see. The important thing is that these things are really understood. Otherwise, what I see in the comments is, but the mille proroghe, only the income limit for the super bonus, but this, but that. Yes. Why? Because right now you don't have the usual spending limits. Your usual spending limits should be the trade balance and inflation. I've explained this to you 100 times, because someone might say, well, then let's just print as much as we want. Then we'll need wheelbarrows of money to buy coffee, like Venezuela, Zimbabwe, and other nonsense like that. No, we're not Italy. We're not Venezuela. We're not Zimbabwe. Our limits on printing money are inflation and the trade balance. As long as we export more than we import, it means we can essentially, without much difficulty, print more money, because it means that in any case more money is coming in. That is, in other words, more foreign currencies entering our economy than is going out. So we could easily spend more, put an end to the super bonus, avoid having to implement those real. What do you think? But politicians like this, enjoy saying that someone who, even though they're a victim of some nonsense done by the one who came before, well, they won't fix it for them. Just like with the fuel excise taxes, but we have fun not removing the excise taxes, even though maybe that's what people would want, right? Or similar things. But no, you still have to stay within those limits. And if you don't stay within those limits, it'll come out somewhere else. So what do you want to do? Well, if I want to spend more on something, I have to cut from somewhere else. Since spending more on something and cutting from somewhere else is usually a great way to piss everyone off, at that point, people try to get by with little tricks, let's say the ISCE, things like that, and these cheap solutions come out, which Italian governments have been struggling with for a long time, except for the periods during the lockdown when it was all 50 billion, 100 billion, 100 billion. Because, funny enough, even though the country was shut down and they were spending 50, 100 billion on relief funds 2, 8, 1, 8, 2, things like that, interest rates were below zero. Why? Because the central bank was buying up all the bonds. Exactly, and it's not some kind of gift from Europe, as so much nonsense is said. It was the only time when Europe did what others do as a matter of course. So when someone says, we got billions from Europe thanks to the central bank, they're talking nonsense. That was the moment when the central bank was simply doing its job. It's when the central bank doesn't step in to defend the debt of the state. It oversees that it's not doing its job. Listen, I really can't be any clearer than this. So, Giorgetti is right when he says that at this moment, debt is our problem. It's just that one small detail needs to be added. Public debt is our problem because we have a central bank that isn't ours, because our debt is essentially virtually foreign currency debt. And so we don't control the currency in which our debt is denominated. And because of a set of rules that are also, poor guy, I mean, I even tried to put myself in his shoes, theoretically in his head, that is. It's not like if I go there and say I want to change everything, they'll just say yes. There's no hope. I get to a point where my only choice is between awful and slightly less awful. So at a certain point, I choose the slightly less awful option. I mean, who knows? Maybe I would have tried to see what would happen if everything collapsed there too, right? But basically, we would have gone back at least temporarily to the previous rules, so the problem wouldn't have been solved. It's not like we would have gotten the others to do what we wanted, So from that perspective, that set of rules makes the deficit important, and therefore the interest on the debt matters. The fact that there isn't a central bank guaranteeing the debt also makes the issue of the debt itself as an absolute value important. I don't know much more than that. At least now you know why. When someone says, hey, what are you talking about? Why are you talking about currency? Well, now maybe once and for all you understand why it's important when I talk about currency. Then there's the whole discussion about the currency being stronger than the state. All of that is true. But right now, as far as debt is concerned, this is the issue with currency. I swear, I don't know how to explain it any more simply than this. Maybe, who knows, I'll come back to this and think of an even easier way to explain it to you. But this is the structure. Clear? I hope it's clear for everyone. Share this around so at least we can take advantage of the fact that the ESM is gone, fortunately, to talk once again about the basics. Thank you.